Hi YouTube, it's Ozzy again. I hope you're well. Today what I'd like to do is show you 20 interesting pieces of Charlotte Rhead pottery and also tell you a little bit about the Rhead family, who were a very interesting bunch of artists from England who were mainly involved in illustrative work and pottery. I'll show you the 20 examples, having close-ups of the back stamps with a little bit of the dates. So it'll be an interesting run through of the work of Charlotte Rhead, which is sometimes neglected because we often hear a lot about Clarence Cliff, Susie Cooper, Molly Hancock, famous English potters, but we tend to think a little bit less about Charlotte Rhead. So that's what I'm going to do today. This artistic family begin with George Rhead Sr. He was born in 1832 and he married in 1854. He had 5 children: George Rhead Jr., Frederick Rhead, Lewis Rhead, Fanny Rhead and Bertram Rhead. And in the main, each of these were skilled in areas of illustration and pottery. For example, looking at Lewis Rhead, born in 1858, he went to America and became a very famous and influential illustrator, and his posters are very collected today. And although the whole family was very talented, it's really the second son that I'm interested in. Born in 1856, Frederick Rhead was the father of Charlotte. He studied at Minton's. In fact, he worked under Louis Solomon in the 1860s, 1870s, where he acquired the pates-a-pate technique. Indeed, one of the pieces that I have here is an example of his work from that time, and let's have a look at that in more detail. After a number of moves and an unsuccessful venture into tile making concern, Frederick Rhead found his way to Woods & Sons Potters in early 1912. There he was very keen to introduce the pates-a-pate technique again, but at an affordable level. Here we have an example of one of his pates-a-pate vases from the time, and you can see the back stamp is very clearly signed with Rhead himself. Now we turn to Charlotte. Charlotte worked at 4 factories principally during her career. The first one was when she joined her father, Fred, at Woods & Sons. That was a little bit after Fred himself had come to the factory. Now in that time it's a little bit difficult to say who exactly designed what. There would have clearly been a lot of intermixing of ideas, and sometimes you can really only tell stylistically who is likely to have done what. All of these pieces here you see are from the Woods period when Charlotte was there. She left in about 1926, so that's quite a few years, and as far as pattern numbers go, the patterns that go up to 900 are probably Charlotte, and of course she did some freelance work after she left, so even patterns into the 1500s have been attributed to her, but mainly collectors base this on stylistic grounds. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these individual items. Firstly, a particularly early design is this Burgess Lee, where it's numbered P28. It has the Burgess Lee stamp on the back. Sometimes you see Woods & Son, sometimes you see Burgess Lee. That's just a trade name for Woods & Son, and it appears from about 1919 onwards, although this design is a bit of an earlier one. Here again we have a Burgess Lee back stamp, and this particular one doesn't have a pattern number. It's a reasonably well-known pattern, and it looks as many things do in this particular shape, very nice. Here we have another example of the open seed poppy, and this time we have a Woods & Sons back stamp. And something like this would have been designed to compete with Moorcroft pomegranate. You can see the colours are quite similar, and the lustres, the lead glazes, the very shiny surface was very popular at the time. This design is known as Pomona, if memory serves me right, and this has a Burgess Lee back stamp, very colourful, and again those lead glazes with the bright lustre on top of it. There were a limited number of chargers done in this type. There's the Japanese lady looking at a letter, there's also a Japanese lady playing a musical instrument. These are made with paint technique, and it's believed that these were done by Charlotte's hand herself, and they don't usually have a signature. In fact, actually, you don't tend to see a signature for either Frederick Rhead or Charlotte Rhead during this period, the Woods & Son period. The only exception to that was the Paints of Paint range that I showed you earlier. And finally, here we have some sort of grape and vine design. It's got a pattern number on the base and a Burgess Lee stamp, showing very much Charlotte's style, abstract, floral, with fruit. Looks very bright, very cheerful, somewhat abstract, and just for your interest, this is actually the one that comes from the front cover of the first edition of the Bumpus book. Okay, in 1926 Charlotte moves on to the Burgess Lee factory at Middleport in Burslem. They had the trade name Burleyware, and she embarked upon quite a range of designs for the company. These were quite expensive designs, they were expensive to make, and she had to train up the tube liners for production. Here are some examples of some of the work that she did at that time. Let's look at some of these individually. Here we have something that's known as the pheasant and pomegranate, and it's one of about 4, 5, maybe 6 designs which were particularly expensive and were thought in the main to have been tubed by Charlotte herself. Not only do you have this design, you also have this one, which is a Persian style, some form. These have numbers and signed Rhead on the back. Often at this time you might see L Rhead for Lottie Rhead, and then later that becomes C Rhead for Charlotte Rhead as she became more famous. Here's another one from this range. This is the Japanese lady reading a letter, and you'll notice it's pretty much the same as the one we saw with Burgess Lee ware 10 years earlier, only this time the lady is facing a different direction. I've seen a couple of variations on this, and these don't turn up all that often. Here we have an absolutely enormous charger with a Viking abstract pattern on it, and you see these in a number of sizes, whereas previously we've seen the sort of lustre glazes. Here we've got a much more lustre with a shine on it. Here we've got a duller lustre and mottled brown, and a lot of her work, especially the slightly cheaper stuff, would have a colour palette of that nature. Interestingly, Charlotte went to America to see her brothers in, I think it's 1926, and during that time her sister, Dolly Rhead, took up her place. She had trained with Charlotte when Charlotte was younger and had gone away and worked in the nursing profession, but stood in just for that time so that Charlotte could go away. And here's an example of some of the work that Dolly did during Charlotte's absence. This is a design that I think is probably Dolly's as it goes, and it has a Rhead on it because of course it was a dolphin Rhead, so that's quite an interesting item. Well, Harold Bennett was also a designer at Burgess Lee at this time, and it appears that by around about 1931 Charlotte had reason to move on. It might have been because the two designers didn't sit very well together, and that concluded her time at Burgess Lee, which had been reasonably successful. In 1932, Charlotte moves to A.J. Richardson. They're a very established pottery, and they trade using Crown du Cul as their name. When Charlotte arrived there, once again, she established a new set of designs, very much in her style. It is during this period that some of the best work, or certainly the most popular work, the most commercially successful work she ever did is produced. For instance, one of the most remarkable designs that she created was this sort of snow glaze, a broken glaze that looks like snow, and you can feel it textured on a surface. This is the wisteria pattern from, I think, 1937. There's also the foxgloves. We're used to seeing Charlotte's design as being quite dark and sombre in colour, but actually you don't have to look very far to find some very bright designs like this, and it sold incredibly well. Here is a sample, a trial design. It wasn't unusual for companies in the potteries to send salespeople out with little examples of things they were considering putting into production, and this might have been one of those, or it might have been a gift from Charlotte to somebody. It certainly isn't standard production. It doesn't have the Crown Ducal stamp, and it doesn't have a tube line mark or a pattern number, but nevertheless an interesting item. So her time at Crown Ducal, awful lot of stuff is produced, very successful period, but towards the end of that she actually develops cancer, and she receives treatment, but that has disrupted her time, and she leaves in 1941. So in the same year Charlotte moves to Woods & Sons. Now this is more or less the same Woods & Sons that she had worked at originally, and this is 1941, so there aren't very many opportunities to produce the kind of fancy goods that she was used to making for both Crown Ducal and Burgess Lee. However, she, during the war, builds up a pattern book. Certainly Bumpers feels, who's written on this quite a bit, that her designs are looking a little bit tired by this time, and she isn't coming up with much that's new. And at the same factory you also have Eddie Sambrook, who's a designer. So one way or another, a book of about 50 patterns is come up with, and of those about 15 or so go into production, and there are some very popular designs at that time. TL37, luster, on-glaze luster, provides a lot of impact for not a lot of money. Here are some examples of her work there, although the collectors amongst you will have spotted the odd one out. In fact, two odd ones really. This design here is TL37, if memory serves me correctly. It's very large, and it's known as the Daisy pattern with a broken glaze. We have one that I'm particularly fond of. It's a sort of a coloured granada. It came in other variants, darker variants and so forth, and in this particular form it's a lampshade. Though you find a vase in this shape as well, it's just missing the top. A very common practice to have multiple uses of vases and lamp bases. And here is a design which may be from her last years at Woods & Son. Now they're using the Bursley ware mark, so it's harking back to the 1920s and Charlotte's time then. And this particular design may be one of a limited number that were developed in 1949, her last year at the company, with Eddie Sambrook, because you can see that this isn't entirely typical of Charlotte. There are some angular shapes here that the experienced collectors would find a little bit odd for her work, and it may be a kind of collaboration she did with Eddie Sandbrook in those last years. But unfortunately this work did not come to the market because Charlotte succumbed to cancer in 1949. But the popularity of her designs was such that Woods & Sons went on selling them right up until 1960. Now I've left one here till last because it's my favourite of all Charlotte Rhead designs. It's actually not Woods & Son Bursley ware second period, as we call it, thing as these others. This is the Florentine pattern from the Burgess Lee period, and it's just so lovely and dark and sombre. And I think in this one design you see how Charlotte could very easily have competed with the best that Moorcroft could have come up with, or any other of the designers at the time, when given a fair wind and the opportunity. Well, there we have it. 20 interesting examples of Charlotte Rhead pottery, including some of the back stamps and so forth. So it's been interesting to see this somewhat neglected female potter from the 20th century. I hope you found that interesting, and until the next time I can find 20 interesting things to show you, I hope you stay well, YouTube. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.